So I want to do a little experiment this morning, and I hope you'll all participate. It's a little sensitive, I understand. So I'm going to ask, if you are over the age of 40, just raise your hand. Raise your hand high. Look around. Look around. Right? If you guys are over the age of 40. Okay, now, if you are 40 and under, please stand up. Okay, 40 and under, yes. Wow. Look around. And a lot of them are up in the balcony, which is great. But look around, church. Think about how many hands were raised versus how many people are standing up right now. Thank you, guys. You guys can take your seats. This morning, I want to share with you for a few minutes about the greatest generation. The greatest generation. In 1998, Tom Brokaw wrote a book about the greatest generation. He described the generation from 1901, that were born in 1901 to about 1924. And he described that this generation was the greatest generation of Americans that ever lived. Why? Because of the things that they faced, the things that they went through. They faced World War II. And if you're like me and you like to look at history and understand what history is, they call that the Great War. And America went through a lot with the bombings that happened in Hawaii and getting involved. We lost millions of soldiers during that war. But they are called the greatest generation because of the great things they did, the heroic acts and the things that they performed. They saw numerous wars. They saw difficulties. They saw depression. They saw recession. And so he coined the phrase, the greatest generation. But then after them, there was the generations that came after them. It said that there was a generation gap. Because the generation that saw all of these great things did not pass these things down to the next generation, which many of you today who raise your hands are a part of that generation. And what made one generation great was not inherited by the next generation. Throughout the Bible, if you read the Old Testament, the Old Testament describes generations. And we constantly read that in the Old Testament, one generation came up and did good, and one generation came and then did bad, and then one generation came up and did good, and it keeps going on this cycle. It keeps going on this cycle. The book of Joshua describes this cycle, and it talks about when Joshua takes over from Moses and actually leads the children of Israel into the promised land, that they do great things, right? Everybody remember the walls of Jericho, right? They marched around the walls for 6 days, and then the last day they shouted, and what happened? The walls fell down. They saw a great miracle of God, where the walls fell down without them even picking up a weapon or doing anything like that. They trusted and they believed and they stood on the word of God, and God did not let them down. Does anybody know that God doesn't let you down? And so they saw great battles. They saw the battle where the sun had to stand still so they could wipe out the armies that were coming against them. And they saw great victories during the time of Joshua. But then we get to the book of Judges. And as we saw the children of Israel do great things during Joshua, and they made this great solemn commitment at the end of the book of Joshua that they would serve the Lord, right? They made this great commitment. But then in the book of Judges, it describes in Judges chapter 2 when Joshua dies. And it says that after Joshua sent the people away, each of the tribes left to take possession of the land allotted to them. And the Israelites served the Lord, notice what it says, throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land that he had been allocated at Timnath Serah in the hill of the country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. But notice verse 10. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that. We had one great generation, possibly you could probably say they were the greatest generation of their time. They saw mighty miracles. They saw the walls fall. They saw the sun stand still until the hand of the enemy, until the enemy was delivered to them, and they killed the entire enemy that stood before them. They saw great defeats. They captured the land, and guess what? When they died, all of that died with them. And then came a generation who knew not God. And if you look at where we stand today, I feel like that's what we see today. When I look at the church and the churches around us, I see a great generation that came out of the Caribbean, that came from other lands to this country, that knew great and mighty exploits of God, that has seen God do great miracles, that knew faith in God. And then I see another generation coming up, and I'm like, do they even know who God is? Because they're questioning their gender. Do they know who God is? The Bible describes here in Judges chapter 2, verse 10, that this generation died that saw God. It said that they knew the great things the Lord had done for Israel. They knew it, they saw it, and then they died. Then a generation came after them who did not know God. And here's the sad part. Here's the sad part. It doesn't mean that they didn't know who God was. They knew who God was, but they just didn't believe in him. They did not believe in God. After everything the generation before them went through to get the land, to be a part of the promise of God, they didn't believe in God. You see, we can be called a great generation, but unless we pass down what God has done in our life to the next generation, we will never be great. It doesn't matter our military victories. It doesn't matter how heroic we are. Unless we pass down what God has done in our life to the next generation will never know the God that we serve. And church, I want to be a part of the greatest generation that ever walked the face of this earth. I want to be a part of the generation that says, I'm going to take the next generation with me, and I'm going to show them all of the good things that God has done. Come on, each one of you, if you look back at your life, you can see the goodness of God in your life. Each one of you can stand. If I were to give you the microphone, I'm not going to give you the microphone, but if I were to give you the microphone, can come here and just talk and tell me of the good and the gracious things that God has done for you. Anybody here can testify to that this morning? Some of you can stand here and tell me how God has healed you from cancer. Some of you can stand here and tell me how God delivered you from situations where people were trying to kill you. God can put you here and tell me about the situations in which you didn't know where the next paycheck was going to come from. You didn't know where the next bill was going to be paid. But you know what? God did it. And so you can come here and you can tell me the goodness and graciousness of God, but yet have you told the next generation of what God has done for you? There's a generation out there that knows not God. And it breaks my heart because that is my generation. That is my generation. And it breaks my heart to not see my generation in this church. And I want this church to be the greatest generation that existed, that New York has ever seen, because we brought the next generation and the next generation and the next generation with us. See, we've got a problem. Barna conducted a study in 2019 among teens aged 13 to 19. And I want you to understand what's happening here. These 4 lines represent global teens, U.S. teens, global Christian teens, and then U.S. Christian teens. And in all of this, in most categories, less than 50% of teens today believe that Jesus was crucified. Less than 50% believe that he was raised from the dead, that he was a miracle worker, that he will return one day. Less than 50% believe that he was God in human form. And the worst one that I feel, the last one, less than 50% believe that he can be communicated with. Do you know what that says? You know what that says to me? It says there that 34% of U.S. Christian teens only believe that God can be communicated. That means that in our churches today across the United States, that 1 out of 3 kids only believe that you can communicate with God, that 1 out of 3 kids only believe that they can have a relationship with God. Think about that. 2 out of 3 kids in U.S. churches today do not believe that they can have a relationship with God. We are living among a next generation that knows not God. And church, this is our responsibility. This is what God has put us here to do. We can go out and go into this community and reach this community, but if we lose our own generations, if we lose our own kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids, our cousins, our nieces and nephews, what will happen to this church? We have a very hard task in front of us because we need to bring God back to a generation that knows not God. And listen, I'm happy to be a part of a church that recognizes that there is a need to minister to the next generation, right? But it's great to just recognize that need, but we need to move. We need to do. We need to do what the Great Commission said. You know what the Great Commission said? You know the Great Commission just didn't say, okay, go tell them to be saved. No. You know what the Great Commission said? To make disciples. And it said that word disciple twice in the Great Commission. That we have to make disciples. We have to teach them. We have to teach the next generation. We have to train up the next generation because the next generation doesn't even believe that they can have a relationship with Christ. We need to value the next generation. Weren't you happy to see young people up here singing and praising God and worshiping with us this morning? And as much as I love that, as much as I love hearing them sing about the same God and being grateful and singing about the goodness of God, it's not enough. Because we need to value the next generation. How do we see the next generation? What are they worth to us? Because let me tell you something, church. If we don't value them correctly, there is a world out there waiting to give them value and give them their value. There is a world out there that's telling them, hey, you want to be this? Go ahead and be this. And you know what? You don't have to tell your parents. And then they arrest the parents if the parents try to intervene. That's happening across our country. As a church, we must value the next generation. What are they worth to us? God spoke about this in Deuteronomy chapter 6. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are on the road and when you are going to bed and when you are getting up. Valuing the next generation starts in our homes. It does not start in this building. Because if you wait for me in a youth service to introduce your kids to the gospel, it is way too late. I promise you, I will do that. But you, all of you, share in that responsibility with me. And let me tell you something, maybe you're not a parent or your kids are grown, your kids are gone, that's fine. But you know what? I need spiritual parents. I need spiritual grandparents, spiritual uncles and aunts that will help me along the way. And so do all the other kids and young people in my generation. They need spiritual fathers and mothers to walk along with them and teach them who your God is. We must value the next generation. We must also listen to the next generation. How many of you know it is important to listen to the next generation? Some of you know that. All right. That's half my battle there. I come to understand something, that listening requires both ears. Can't just listen with one. You got to listen with both. And if you've gone through, marriage counseling, they tell you that communication is the key to a good relationship, right? If we build a relationship with God, communication with God is a key factor in our relationship with God. That is why we pray, right? And so we must be able to communicate with the next generation. Are we trying to understand them? Or do we just want them to understand us and our way of doing things? And they must adjust to our way of doing things all the time. Wow, okay, that was loud. Think about it. I was sitting in the car with my kids, and their grandmothers were talking to them, and somehow this led into a gospel presentation to my oldest daughter, Mia, who was 5. And when they asked her, well, how do you get to heaven? Mia said, well, you got to die. And I was like, yes, give it to them, girl, give it to them. Not the answer they wanted to hear, but she was right. Everybody wants to get to heaven, but nobody want to die. Even though she gave the right answer, sometimes we think, well, that's the wrong answer. We're not listening to the next generation. They have their own way of thinking. They have their own way of understanding. And if we're not listening to them, how do we know that we can reach them if we don't listen to them? We can't expect that they're going to just line up and follow us blindly when they don't even know what we've been through. They don't know our lives. They don't know who we really are. So we must listen to the next generation. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in verse 19, Paul talks here, even though I am a free man with no master, I've become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. And when I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I lived under the law. Even though I am not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of the Lord. I obey the law of Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessing. Paul decided that he would use his freedom to voluntarily become a slave or servant to the people he was trying to reach for Christ. You see, Paul understood something here. Paul understood that this type of posture as a slave or servant to others who do not know Christ gives him the flexibility to minister freely to them. And you see, those who can never see anything but their own point of view and who never make an attempt to understand the mind and heart of others will never succeed as friends. Church, I'm telling you, if we don't try to understand the next generation, we will never succeed in winning them for Christ. As hard as it may be, because we are a weird and difficult generation. Right? We are a weird and difficult generation. We are that generation that's built on technology. We are a generation that this has changed and revolutionized our life. My 2-year-old daughter can operate this phone better than some of you, unfortunately. And guess what? They will never know, understand an existence without this. They will never know what it was like to live before cell phone. And if you remember pre-cell phone, wow, you just really aged yourself there. Chloe, you remember what life was like without cell phones? You guys remember what life was like without cell phones? Look at that. And you got to remember something. Whatever they want to know, guess what? They're going to find it right here. Right? So let me tell you something. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be always right. You just have to be real, and you just have to be genuine, and you just need to pass down what God has done for you, because they'll fact check you. Right? So just be real. This is what Paul was saying. I'm going to be a Jew to the Jew, and I'm going to be a Gentile to the Gentile, because their cultures were completely different. And he understood that he could not just go in and demand that they be like him in order for him to minister to them. We cannot demand a generation who has not gone through what you have gone through, who knows what you have known, who has sang hymns all their life, to come and be like us. We need to be open to them. We need to be willing to answer their questions. We need to be willing to spend the time to pass down what God has done. You saw in that skit how they beautifully portrayed that we need to pass down what God has done to the next generation. And Paul did this so beautifully because we must love the next generation. Church, we must love the next generation. I believe when you look at what Paul did, when he became a Jew to the Jew, when he became a Gentile, when he adopted himself to reach the people, he showed some great love, because that is what Jesus did. Jesus left all of heaven to come down on earth and take the form of a man so that he could love us. He could experience what we experience. He could go through what we went through. He can experience human emotion and knows what it's like to be betrayed, knows what it's like to be hurt, knows what it's like to be accused falsely of a crime that he did not commit, knows what it's like to be physically beaten and abused and assaulted, and knows what it's like to walk and stare death in the face. And so he loved us, and we must love the next generation. John, in the book of John, it talks about a story in John chapter 8. And I love this story. I know the pastor preached about this a few weeks ago. But I see something modeled here that you don't see in many other places, because it says that they brought this woman who was caught in the act of adultery, literally ripping her out of that room and bringing her before Jesus, right? The religious leaders brought her, and they were ready to stone her to death because that was what the law said. And they kept demanding an answer, and he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." But then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. And when the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." What a beautiful interaction between Jesus and this woman. And I believe that if you look closely, you can see the next generation in this woman, because they are caught up in some messed up things. And some of it is not even their fault, but they are bombarded with some real evil nonsense, because that's the only way I can describe it. They are bombarded every day. They go to schools, and this stuff is pushed to them in schools. They see it all over social media, and their lives are honestly, they're tormented by this to the point of which they're forced to follow this stuff. And so you've got this woman who was, I don't know her story, but she was caught in this vile act of sin, and then she's brought in her embarrassment, she's brought in her shame, she's brought in this disgusting manner before the priest and before Jesus, and the fate of her life rests in Jesus' hand. And let me tell you something, the next generation, the fate of the next generation rests in your hands, because you know what? Jesus has given you the authority and the command to go into all the world and preach this gospel and to make disciples. And so the next generation is there. And you know what though? We many times as a church, we come as those holding the stones towards the next generation. Because sometimes they don't line up to what we expect. They don't dress the way we want them to dress. They don't speak the way we want them to speak. They don't sing the songs we want them to sing. They don't act the way we want them to act. They don't look the way we want them to look. But you know what? God created them, God loves them, and God wants to see them in eternity alongside you. And so, church, we have a responsibility to the next generation. I have a responsibility to my kids. Yes, I have to provide for them. I have to put a roof over their head, and I have to put them through school. But Deuteronomy chapter 6 says, I must tell them of what God has done in my life so that they would know who God is. It is not your responsibility, it is my responsibility. And then I bring them to this church, and then guess what? When I bring them to this church, then it is all of our responsibilities collectively as a church to show them who God is to us. And I stand here this morning and I say to you, I believe that the greatest generation is a generation that stands up and says, we will not see another generation lost, but we will proclaim the goodness of God that was in our life, that God did for us, that the generation before us put into our lives, and we will make sure that we show the next generation who God is. That is the greatest generation. And church, that is the generation I want to be a part of.